Hi, Assalamu alaikum. My name's Lynn Houmdi and I am one of the contributors to the compendium OUR Morocco. And my story is about my arrival in Essaouira and settling in to live there, and I also tell the stories of some of the people I met there. For those of you who don't know, Essaouira is a small port town on Morocco's Atlantic coast, and it is famous for having been a centre of Jewish culture during previous centuries, and also for its music festivals. And I now spend my time between Essaouira and Edinburgh in Scotland with my family, which is partially Moroccan and partially British. So I'm going to be reading my chapter, which is called Gratitude from the Windy City of Essaouira. I arrived in Morocco for what turned out to be a 27-month stay at the start of September 2012, just as the unrest of the so-called Arab Spring was dissipating or being quashed throughout North Africa. For the previous year and a bit, I had been travelling between my hometown of Edinburgh, Scotland, and Essaouira, Morocco, every 2 to 3 months. These frequent trips were to meet someone I had met during the 2011 Gnawa World Music Festival, for which Essaouira is known. Our relationship had become much more than a holiday romance. Now I was taking the plunge and moving to Africa. An opportunity had arisen to request a voluntary redundancy package from my career in the UK civil service. I had been hoping and waiting for 3 years to qualify. It hadn't looked likely I would, and I spent my lunch breaks dreaming up escape routes and business startup plans. Then, in the absurd way that government works, on the cusp of a referendum on Scottish independence, my position as head of UK relations was merged with another role. With my job being struck off an ever tighter departmental budget and having a convincing story about being perpetually separated from my partner in Morocco, suddenly I was considered eligible for the payoff, and you couldn't see me for all the dust in the Sahara. However, I couldn't leave immediately, so during my final 6 months as a UK government official, I developed a plan to change my life completely. My plan at its base was very simple. Number 1, take the first flight to Morocco. Number 2, live with my love. Number 3, start a small bed and breakfast. I had cash, I had enthusiasm, and I was determined to acquire the skills. Also, I certainly wasn't going to say no to 300 plus days of sunshine a year. So it was, on an otherwise unremarkable weekday in September 2012, while my former colleagues continued to unpick disputes between the UK and Scottish governments, that I jetted off from the Edinburgh airport for a new life in Morocco. I landed in Marrakesh to a text message from my partner to say he was on his way. I was about to learn my first Moroccan lesson: patience. While I waited for him, I engaged in the national occupation of people watching while sitting outside the airport. Taxis and tour buses sped through the arrivals and departures. I looked at each one in anticipation, anxious to begin anew. As I was to learn, not much happens very quickly in Morocco. Coming from the UK, where every minute of every day was accounted for, I had to adjust to waiting like this. About an hour and a half later, over dinner, I found out the reason for the delay. My partner had travelled up to Marrakesh on the 6 a.m. bus from Essaouira with a friend who has a vehicle rental agency. The friend had a new car to collect in Marrakesh, and the plan was that they would be finished in time to collect me in the late afternoon at the airport, in the new car. It seemed like a good plan. I knew Moroccans drive a hard bargain, but surely it didn't take a whole day of haggling to agree on the price of a car. I had forgotten that other national occupation in Francophone Africa: bureaucracy. The purchase of the car was apparently relatively simple. The time-consuming part had been getting the requisite papers to register, insure, and actually own the car. This involved travelling across Marrakesh, papers in hand, to queue and collect cachet, rubber stamps, and scribbled signatures in over 40 degrees Celsius, 100 Fahrenheit heat. A third national occupation in Morocco is hospitality. Often, someone you may have only met once, would be happy to welcome you into their home and offer you what they have, no matter how little. Luckily for the guys, our car purchasing friend had a contact in Marrakesh who was able to offer them lunch, a cold shower, and space for a siesta while they waited for the city bureaucrats to do their thing. So it was that by the time I arrived in Essaouira, tired but happy to be there, our day had already offered a snapshot of what I came to know intimately during my life in Morocco. Interminable bureaucracy and lots of waiting, both made all the more palatable by the helping hands and hospitality of friends. On that day, my partner and his friends introduced me to a proverb I've heard many times since in Morocco. Europeans have watches, but Africans have time. My new home and family. The history and destiny of Essaouira, formerly known as Mogador, lie in its location on the Atlantic Ocean. It has, however, more recently achieved fame as one of the locations for the TV series Game of Thrones, which transformed the town into a film set while I was living there. Nestled in a bay protected by an archipelago of uninhabited islands, Essaouira is sheltered from the trade winds that have brought visitors, goods and traditions from across the world, and likewise transported them onwards. It doesn't feel very sheltered when attempting a beach walk while the wind blows sand horizontally into the face. In summer, however, compared to the sweltering heat inland, the breeze is a blessing. Alhamdulillah. Arabic is replete with Allah phrases, as I like to call them, and they are key in an Islamic society like Morocco. Alhamdulillah literally means thanks be to God, or a more secular expression might be thank goodness, and it peppers every conversation between Moroccans. The automatic way in which Moroccans use this phrase, I believe, demonstrates their innate gratitude. They don't just use it to be grateful for their own good fortune. It is used as a reminder of those less fortunate than themselves. In many instances, a better translation would be, I am grateful, it could be worse. So when inquiring after someone's health, they will always reply, Alhamdulillah, no matter how they're feeling. Even when catastrophe strikes, a Moroccan expresses gratitude that the situation isn't even more disastrous. Life in Essaouira was seldom disastrous, but nonetheless not always easy. But I had plenty to be grateful for, not least the welcome I received from my partner's family and friends. I was always included in festivities such as Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, and Ftour, the meal to break the fast during Ramadan. And I was usually fed to the point that they would leave me in the guest salon with a blanket and some cushions to have a nap. Learning about the past. I can also say Alhamdulillah for all the friends and connections I made in Essaouira and the insight they gave me into the history, culture and lifestyle of local people. While working with the High Atlas Foundation in Essaouira, I was responsible for managing this US Moroccan non-profit's first intercultural heritage project. The aim of the project was to use the multicultural and multi-faith, Christian, Jewish and Muslim history of Essaouira to educate the younger generation of Moroccans in the lessons of peaceful cohabitation in the past. Many people are still surprised to learn of Morocco's significant Jewish history, in which Mogador, as it was known, played a prominent part. Through this work, I met Asher Knafo, author, educator, and son of Mogador, who had left with his family in 1951. I accompanied him as he transcribed the rich data of the tombs in one of Essaouira's 2 Jewish cemeteries. The other, older one, containing a mausoleum of Rabbi Haim Pinto, is across the road being slowly ravaged by the Atlantic waves. Asher's grandfather, Rabbi David Knafo, was the chief rabbi and a rabbinical judge of Essaouira. He died in 1937 and was joined in the cemetery a few years later by 2 friends, Rabbi David Al-Qaim and Rabbi David Yefla. As well as being a rabbi, David Al-Qaim was a celebrated poet and stonemason. Thanks to this unique combination of skills, the epitaphs of Mogador carved in the late 19th and early 20th centuries have a rich poetry. Asher told me, Al-Qaim had many local imitators, and although he never signed his works, his monumental engravings are recognizable to those who know what to look for. Through Asher, I met Haim Biton, then living between Morocco and San Diego, USA, as he lovingly restored Slat al-Kahal. This historic building was one of some 40 synagogues from the period when around half of Mogador's population was Jewish. An amateur historian, Haim helped me piece together the rich Jewish heritage of Essaouira, which had begun when Sultan Sidi Mohammed ben Abdullah invited prominent Jewish merchant families, many of whose ancestors had been expelled from Andalusia during the Reconquest, to settle in Mogador starting in the mid-18th century. The Sultan had sought to orient his kingdom and its trading links towards the west, where he was the first foreign head of state to recognise US independence from Britain. Even before the development of trade routes to Europe, Mogador was known as the port of Timbuktu, as it was located at the end of long caravan routes that brought goods and people and their traditions into North Africa and out across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. Haim explained that Mogador had many British connections. He showed me an old tea chest in the synagogue dating from 1858. There are many theories regarding the origin of the Moroccan tradition of green tea with mint, but he was sure British traders were involved somehow, perhaps via networks of Jewish merchants between Mogador and Manchester. Another British link was Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's war secretary during World War II, Leslie Hoare Belisha, whose father had lived in the Mogador Mellah, the Jewish quarter. Getting to know the locals. Living in Morocco, where the average standard of living is lower than in Europe, I was confronted on a daily basis with extreme poverty. That still, I had much to be grateful for. Alhamdulillah. I learned other Allah phrases to respond to requests for money as I moved around the Medina. Laisa halalik means something like, may God make things easier for you. Laista means something akin to, God protect you. I often found myself explaining to foreign visitors that the lack of state-sponsored social safety net in Morocco was typically compensated by family and neighbours helping each other out. This meant that anyone encountered living on the street really had no one to support them. In such a community-focused society, this level of social isolation and vulnerability was shocking to me. It was also through my work with the High Atlas Foundation that I got to know Association Beatty. Beatty means my house, and the association is a national charity working with children from complex and challenging socio-economic and family situations. Hassan is the indefatigable coordinator of the Beatty Centre in Essaouira. He graduated in sociology from Mohammed V University in Rabat in a period when the Makhzen, the ruling elite, were restricting access to classes in the humanities and social sciences, as these subjects were deemed to have spawned too many left-leaning, anti-regime activists. Hassan's sense of social justice was born of the infamous years of lead in the 1960s to 1980s, when the state suppressed opposition mercilessly, and it frames his work to this day. Through Hassan, I learnt of the children who couldn't be educated because their mothers feared repercussions for registering a birth outside of marriage. Without official identity papers, these children simply didn't exist in the eyes of the state. I learned of a child forced to listen while his blind mother paid her rent for the shelter of an unsanitary slum of dubious ownership in the Mellah to a man pretending to be the landlord in the only way a woman of no financial means could. I also learned of the children who sell tissues to tourists to bring in a family income instead of attending school. At Beatty, children such as these receive social work support, a daily hot meal, and a place safe from the chaos at home to do their homework and realise their dreams. Those excluded from education follow a curriculum that makes it possible for them to join a mainstream school when their lives are stable. While I was living in Essaouira, a record number of Beatty kids achieved their high school degree, enabling them to go on to university. Many of them were provided with school equipment through funds I raised alongside local non-Moroccan residents. The nearest university to Essaouira is in Marrakesh, and many students are daunted by the idea of living in a big city, or they simply can't afford it. This means they don't attend lectures consistently. Strong family ties, an obligation to bring income into the family, and the limited prospects of graduate-level employment mean that many young Moroccans consider university study a waste of time. All of these are reasons why enrolment at Moroccan universities drops off sharply after the first year when the state student grant falls away. When I moved to Morocco in September 2012, Morocco's experience of the so-called Arab Spring was over. However, a number of graduates had taken the opportunity of that region-wide moment of protest to revive the activist spirit of the diplômés chômeurs, unemployed graduates, that had emerged during the period of political unrest of Hassan's student days in the 1990s. Many days working for the High Atlas Foundation considered of me scuttling from one délégation, local outposts of national ministries, to another across the large paved square set back from the beach, seeking information, funds and support for the Foundation's projects that I managed. As I did, I saw groups of men and women staging demonstrations outside the provincial government building and the higher education délégation. Sometimes they waved banners. Occasionally they banged pots. Typically they had a tagine steaming on a makeshift brazier. One day my partner showed me a social media post by one of his friends who had been the victim of state brutality during one of these protests. He ended up in hospital. I later interviewed him as part of the research for my master's dissertation, an ethnographic study of Essaouira's unemployed graduate protests during the Arab Spring. By the time I was interviewing them, typically over many cups of hot, sweet mint tea in cafes around Essaouira after the nighttime Tarawih prayers of Ramadan in 2018, most of the former diplômés chômeurs had succeeded in getting their stated goal of public sector employment. However, in a twist of their fate in a neoliberal globalized economy, new teaching jobs have become contractual and no longer offered the stability that the government jobs of the past had promised. Many of the protesters, particularly the women, had hidden their participation from friends and family, fearing criticism or shame. Several of my interviewees had never spoken of their participation to an outsider. Many expressed gratitude that I wanted to learn of their lived experiences and help them process what had been a stressful period in their lives when they had chosen to throw their time and energy into protest at the risk of missing alternative employment opportunities and risking criticism or worse. They felt betrayed because the post-colonial promise that education would unlock access to the middle classes via stable government jobs had been whisked away from their generation as the neoliberal state shrank and everyone was encouraged to fend for themselves. For young Moroccans, whether graduates or not, the lack of job opportunities is not only a financial concern, but it also delays their entry into true adulthood. For many young and not so young Swiris, as natives of Essaouira are called, it's not affordable to move out of the family home until they find stable employment. Furthermore, until they can do either of those things, they feel unable to get married and start a family of their own, both of which are culturally very important in Morocco. One local woman interviewed for my research told me that she wasn't married because of unemployment. Now, in her 40s, she lamented, marriage offers came from unsuitably young men. The lack of economic prospects impacts social mobility and explains why so many locals hope to find happiness in a partnership with a non-Moroccan. In a town like Essaouira, which is so dependent on tourism, the constant supply of unskilled labour from the surrounding area, Essaouira is one of Morocco's most rural provinces, keeps wages low and employment precarious. In this setting, where locals come into frequent contact with people from other countries and cultures, it is only natural that they dream of a worry-free life on the northern side of the Mediterranean. In the wake of COVID-19, which has decimated world tourism and had a knock-on effect on Essaouira's other main industry, fishing, as restaurants closed, it is hard to imagine sometimes the incredibly basic necessities Swearies dream of as I write this. Living a dream. Although not originally our plan, I never did open a bed and breakfast, departure from Morocco also became a shared dream for my partner and me. We are more fortunate than many Moroccans in that we had that choice. In 2014, my partner became my husband. We were unceremoniously married in a small garage across the street from Essaouira's bus station. The courthouse where the Adoul, public notary, normally had his office, had been torn down to be rebuilt, and the temporary court accommodation was insufficient for notaries' offices. It was in this terribly unromantic setting that, with a leap of faith, we each signed our names on blank pieces of paper, above which our vows would be printed in Arabic, and my betrothed offered me a symbolic gift of 200 Moroccan dirham, about $20, which he'd borrowed from a friend. My in-laws threw a party at their home for our wedding. Our invitees were treated to my menu, seafood pastilla, a kind of phyllo pastry pie of seafood and noodles, because I don't eat meat, and the traditional beef and apricot tagine. After all the food and plenty of dancing, everyone slept well that night. Feeling that our own social and economic opportunities were greater in my home country of Scotland, we left Morocco in December 2014, following a tortuous UK visa process. Our son Ryan was born in Scotland in August 2015. Our small Scottish-Moroccan family lives a simple life, principally now in Edinburgh, blending what we can of our cultures, our traditions and our languages, thereby creating something that is uniquely ours. Alhamdulillah. This story, however, is not only ours. It's the story of all those people who touched our shared lives over the last 9 years, not just those I've mentioned here. I'm grateful that our lives intersected with theirs and for the chance to release their stories as well as mine. Morocco is a nation of storytellers, but not every story has a voice. If I have been able to offer a voice to someone through my work and my writing, then all I can say is Alhamdulillah.
Hey!